I guess I'll introduce after the video. That would make sense. But just want to shout out, we got Bryn King, who was here at one of our first sessions, I think our second session. Nice to see you again. We got Robert Joseph out here from the Bechtel Foundation, who helped me in the initial stages of thinking this whole thing up, and was really pushed very hard around the idea of expanding the spring class portion of this. So you can partially blame him for the rigor that we've added to this program. So thanks, guys. Here, and then I'll introduce Allison and Jennifer after the video. This video, Allison, do you want to tee up the video, what we're about to watch?
Sure. So this video was produced by the Stewart Foundation, the foundation that I work for. It was really just interviewing a variety of stakeholders, policymakers, folks working in the field, folks working at the district level, gearing up to the launch of our Education Equals initiative, and also just in general to be used to garner support for foster youth and education.
All of my life, I lied to all my friends, everyone I've known, saying, those are my parents, that's my mom and dad.
I was so busy trying to be invisible so I wouldn't be harmed or further negated.
They didn't know why I was coming to school the way I was. They didn't know why I wasn't doing my best in classes.
In some ways, I wanted them to know. I wanted them to know that I was in the system because I was like dying for help.
At that time, I didn't say anything to my teacher. If I couldn't do it, I just let myself fail, which is really bad.
They were used to being invisible. It's a group of kids that doesn't really matter.
For a lawmaker sitting in an office in Sacramento or back in Washington, D.C., right, it's 2% of the student population. But for me, right, that's Carl.
While it may be small in absolute numbers, the ripple effect on society is rather extreme.
I think if we increase the understanding of teachers about the implications of and the conditions that foster children operate under, it's going to help everybody.
But I'd like to believe that we'll look back in 20 years and we'll see this time as that time of change where everything changed.
We may not be able to give them a permanent family. We may not be able to connect them back to their family. We may not be able to fix what brought them into the system. But we certainly have the ability to make sure they get a good education.
Each and every teacher, each and every counselor, each and every school nurse, each and every social worker that touches that young person's life has a chance to change that life.
If I had a chance to know in advance that I had a child coming to me from a foster placement, if I had even a day, I could do something different. I don't get that.
Systems have to support people, and people have to support kids. The system in and of itself doesn't support kids. It manages and organizes, but it's a personal connection that really moves the heart and the mind of a child.
I went to about 9 high schools, and all of them, nobody could ever track my credits correctly. And at one point I'd have 0 credits, one point I'd have 270.
You should ask, like, since you moved so many different schools, do you feel like you can catch up, or should we put you at a lower level?
I took Algebra 1 like 6 times, and I was a master at it by the last time, and they would never put me in the classes past that because they couldn't prove that I already passed that.
That's why we all got together and CPS worked with us and we created the Foster Focus database. So now every night we get an upload from CPS, Child Protective Services, that lets us know all of the kids that are currently in the system.
First of all, getting the data in a timely fashion allows the teacher from day one to say, I know you.
All those things a parent would do, I think Foster Focus does a bit of the same kind of work. So if I'm a student and I walk in and you know what my classes have been, and you know what my classes are that I need, and you know that I struggle in reading, and you're going to find someone to help me, the difference to me is huge. That means that first week, month, I'm in your school, I don't have to pretend like I know what's going on.
Then secondly, being able to update the data on a regular basis means that if the child does move, there's no break in the quality and the consistency of their instruction. The other database we call School Connect, and what that does is it geo-maps the foster homes in the attendance area of schools.
All of the foster homes in the attendance area pop up on the screen. Now, each one of those homes, if you click into them, there's 130 characteristics about the foster home available for the social worker to look at. And the beauty of that is, if you do have to move a child, we're trying to get them the best possible home in the same school attendance area.
We're seeing an amazing decrease in the number of incidents that kids get involved in. No expulsions in 3 years for this population of students is an amazing accomplishment.
They have lives that are fairly fragile. Even when they're succeeding, kind of one thing can tug on one string and things start to unravel. And so somebody needs to notice.
Eventually I ended up in the system for the first time, and I had a really rough year my freshman year. My freshman year, I was failing classes, a lot of classes.
I think I was very fortunate to be pulled into a program called AVID, and it started in middle school, and that was the first time I really thought about college. No one thinks about college in middle school. No one thinks about college in middle school.
So that was the one class probably never failed. I was always, and I knew I wanted to go to college, but I think when I got to my freshman year, I didn't think it was going to happen.
AVID is an incredible resource for our foster youth. It provides our students with a level of support that they typically wouldn't get in the general education experience.
When I went into the system, I can't think of anyone actually looking out for my best interests, because I thought it was just me, myself, and this whole entire world. And I'm taking care of myself.
It's at least one thing that remains consistent, even though schools are different, teachers are different. She has somebody on the campus now that, in a program that she knows that, okay, this is something that I'm familiar with.
It just kind of kept me motivated. It kept reminding me why I was doing everything.
It implanted the idea of going to college and life after 18 into my mind. So I feel like that kind of built a solid foundation. So when I found myself in 9th grade going through, and I also continued in high school into the AVID program, it gave me something to go back to, that someone told me I could go to school.
Well, I'm definitely nervous, but I know I'm ready to go to college. I know that I've been working my butt off to get there, and I don't know exactly what I want to be, but I know I want to get back to where I came from, like foster care and stuff like that, and I want to make a difference.
I might not have been as open unless I had seen enough of the behavior of the adult to know the adult was not going to harm me. It would have been a big relief.
I got put into foster care. That's when I started switching schools. And I went to about 9 high schools. I didn't really do well going through all those schools. In my last school, with certain teachers and people supporting me, I stepped up and took care of my stuff.
I had talked with my principal, and I said, I think we've got an opportunity here where we can affect kids' lives. And we spent the whole year just connecting with those kids, finding out from the students' perspective what was their problems. We created a weekly student advisory class. Here it's called an advocacy class, but it's a student advisory class where we meet the kids every week for 40 minutes. So it's a check-in. We know how you're doing.
We were told by a ton of different people that you can't do that. The kids aren't going to want to know, the kids aren't going to want anybody else to know, the kids aren't going to want to come together. It was kind of an amazing thing because you saw kids, their whole posture and demeanor and their attitudes changed, because all of a sudden they looked around and they weren't one, and those 44 represented a group, a family, a dynamic that they didn't know existed.
They were able to draw from each other and their experiences. Kids got, ain't no problem, how you deal with it. So this kid said, hey, this is how I deal with it. Yeah, I understand where you've been from, I've been to that, but if you apply this, then this is going to happen.
I got treated like somebody was paying attention to me. Wasn't just a high school where, okay, here's another foster kid that's coming through. I came here, I got help with what I needed, clothes, school dance, school supplies.
We wanted to create a normalizing experiences for kids. So everything that was a problem for the kids that they told us in year one, in terms of not being able to go to dances, not being able to get a yearbook, not being able to go to a football game, it all became eliminated.
He found out I had never been to a school dance because I didn't care because I moved. And he told me, man, this is your school now, this is your home. You're not gonna go anywhere after this school. And so you need to just do the best you can and have a good time. This is your high school, you're not going anywhere. And when he told me that, everything changed.
We rearranged the schooling to fit the kid, and it didn't cost any money.
We have seen an increase in grades and an increase in positive attendance and a decrease in behavior issues and a decrease in mobility.
So I felt cared about, and that made a big difference because when you feel like you have people backing you up, it definitely makes life a lot easier to walk through.
I think if you work in this field, you have to go home every night with the understanding that you failed somebody that day. But it's also what wakes you up the next morning and gets you back out there to do that work. It's literally a kid at a time.
What type of program do you put in place that helps this kid so that kid can move on and don't become a dependent upon society but contributes to society?
Having the skills and everything necessary all allowed me to truly appreciate my education and actually realize what's there for me and that it's a good resource, it's a stable environment, it's my future, right? So everything became education.
Foster youth have a really unique perspective. They've often seen the darkest side of humanity, but they're often the most compassionate people.
Bottom line, if a child is in the system, we become their parent. We should treat those children just like we would with our own.
We're so focused on only my survival. And then what happens is it tends to be at the expense of your survival. We begin to focus on our survival. All of a sudden, there are no disconnected. There are no fosters. There is just us.
Okay, so I want to welcome up Allison Sparks and Jennifer Rodriguez. Allison is a program officer at the Stewart Foundation, and the Stewart Foundation does a lot of lead research on work on the intersection of education and foster care work as well, but quite a bit on education and foster care in California and Washington State, and to a large degree I can tell you that the work coming out of Stewart Foundation is influencing the national conversation to a large degree, and that's pretty impressive stuff. So we're happy to have Allison here. Jennifer Rodriguez recently assumed leadership of the Youth Law Center as the executive director. She's got a long history in foster youth advocacy and involvement from her days at CYC. And up through the Youth Law Center and getting her law degree, and it's an incredible story of what the role education played in your life and kind of what that means for kids in the system. So I'd like to start off with Allison. We kind of saw the pipeline, the educational pipeline that you guys are working on here in California. I just kind of wanted to throw out to you, I know you also know you've got a grantee up in Washington State, and we discussed this a little bit earlier today, but what Treehouse is doing, and then kind of and bring that to California for us.
Great. Well, I also have a ton of resources here, and I guess maybe we can pass them out now. Sure. Some of them will help reference the things that I'm mentioning. So, maybe do you want to do this on that side? there's a lot that I'm learning about this this subject. I just started at Stewart last April. Previously, I had worked in direct services with foster youth, and also I know some of you are social welfare students. I actually went to the MSW program at UC Berkeley, so if you have any questions that sort of specifically relate to how did you go from getting your MSW to being in philanthropy and working with large-scale systems, then I would be happy to answer some of those too. So basically, the Stewart Foundation has a long history of working in this area, and this one handout that you guys see here, it says mapping our approach. That'll give the best description of sort of the trajectory of what we've been doing. We early in 2000 and in the late 1990s started collecting data on where the needs were for foster youth, what issues exactly were there that were holding foster youth back from graduating and acting as barriers to them getting into college. From there, we partnered with some direct service agencies and started to explore possible solutions. And now, really, it's an exciting time for us because we're starting to see these all come to scale. And so what we have right now, or what we're launching right now, is our Education Equals initiative. We're working with Fresno, Sacramento, and Orange County to basically take all these services that we found support foster youth and in a really deep level implement them on the county, partnering that with intense data collection and also really maintaining cross systems collaboration and supporting shared learning communities, so continuously learning. We're hoping that we see within the next 5 years that in these counties foster youth actually succeed at rates better than or equal to their peers. And in isolated places, we have seen this. I think last week, Amy was mentioning in the Guardian Scholars programs that the youth are actually being retained in colleges more than the general population. So yeah, we one of the other big focuses here is on outcomes and is on metrics. And we did know that one of the most important things for us is that we actually wanted to see significant change. And also pulling all the programs together to support the whole pipeline from cradle to college and to career. Daniel was mentioning Treehouse, an organization that I work with in Washington State. That was sort of one of the single programs that we supported, where they were placing educational liaisons in the districts who knew about all the laws for foster youth and all the rights of foster youth, and offer trainings for caregivers specifically, so that the caregivers could go and advocate for their youth. And they found that almost dropped expulsions 100%, and youth were actually getting the services that were their rights, like special ed screenings and so on and so forth. And then let's see here. There's one other. I don't know. That's gone out of my head. But I'm sure that we can dive deeper into it, and I can talk some more about some of the specific grantees. And so maybe I will now transition to Jennifer, and she can get up, and we'll go back and forth.
Sure. So Daniel said, I'm Jennifer Rodriguez, Executive Director at the Youth Law Center, and let's see, I've been working on educational advocacy for foster youth actually since 1999. And when I came, and I started basically immediately after aging out of foster care, because my own experience really led me to believe that education, let me say it this way, I have seen probably every side and been on every side of the equation, both the positive outcomes and the negative outcomes. So everything from in my elementary school years, I was put into GATE programs, and so sort of had specialized services there. And then as things started to fall apart in my life, by middle school, I was put into special education and continuation programs that were almost 100% foster youth, so it was really segregated out from the rest of the school population.
by the time I hit high school, I was in classrooms for severely emotionally disturbed students that were sort of in the continuation and community schools, and actually ultimately ended up leaving school with no credits at all because I was moved more than once every single semester in school. And the schools had no way of transferring over. I was in juvenile hall, I was in psych hospitals, I was attending group home schools, non-public schools, all of these special schools that all had these very obscure ways of assigning us credits and calculating credits. And I would say that probably by the time I hit 9th grade, I had completely given up on school. I was never outraged. I was never sad about education. I'm always impressed when I hear young people like the ones in the video who were saying they really wanted to succeed, because I just wanted to be done with it. The only reason I would attend school at all was basically because the group homes would require us to attend school. And I was actually always kind of glad, because whenever I was moved to a new group home, which would happen every few months, typically there was a wait for anywhere from a month to sometimes 3 or 4 months while they tried to convince a school to take me, because by that point in time I had a lengthy behavioral record as well. I had been suspended, I had been expelled a couple of times. I was on psychotropic medications. So I was not a desirable candidate for any school really to want to take in. And, you know, I just sort of, it was the best times for me in school, in all honesty, were sort of those transition months where I got to stay home and watch soap operas all day or go to the food bank with the staff and shop for our, you know, cereal, because it was just done. I didn't see any way, I did not see myself succeeding in school. I knew that nobody had any positive expectations for me related to school. And so I was just kind of tired of failing. And I felt a lot like there was the young lady there who said that in the video that she never admitted to anybody that she was in foster care. Well, for some of us, we didn't have that option. Because I was in special ed and I lived in group homes where we all went to a bunch of different schools, the little yellow bus, like literally, you know, you guys have all heard E40 talking about the little yellow bus. Well, some of us had to go to school every day on the little yellow bus, and it was clear to everyone that we were group home kids. You know, we didn't have any parents or guardians by the way we acted. So it was really, I was very much ashamed and felt like it was sort of written all over my face that I was different from other kids. And I was in care here in the Bay Area, so I moved through San Francisco, San Mateo, Alameda, Marin, and then ultimately aged out of Santa Clara County. I was moved placements through all of those counties. And the experience was slightly different depending on what county I was in. I think I had the worst experience once I was ultimately put in Santa Clara County, because the group home that I ended up aging out of was in a very wealthy neighborhood, and the only school that had a program for severely emotionally disturbed students. This is a school where I, you know, sort of did my last semester. I can't ever say that I completed or anywhere close to completed high school. Was this school called Leland. That was this very ritzy school where, like, at 16 all of the kids got their own cars, and you know, it was almost exclusively all white, and so there was one other Latina girl that was at the school and 2 other, you know, black kids that were there, and that was it. So I stuck out in every single way possible being at that school, and so I was just so discouraged. Basically, I never saw myself as, you know, succeeding in any educational environment. So then I had the opportunity after leaving care to start community college. Well, let me just say that after I left foster care, I ended up going into a program called Job Corps, where basically a requirement of getting into Job Corps is that you get a GED. You cannot start vocational training until you get a GED. So they forced me to get a GED, sort of against my will. And that was a really interesting experience for me, because Job Corps does this really obnoxious thing where you take the GED test, and then they take the people in the center that rank the highest on the GED test, and they enter you into something called the Academic Olympics, where you compete against other people in whatever area you score the highest in. And so they pulled me as scoring the highest in the verbal area, which I had never identified with doing well in school in any particular way. I'd sort of, those early years of being in GATE programs were completely lost. By the time I hit 6th grade and I had been labeled as a troubled kid, and here's another piece that I didn't say, is that I was, from birth, I was in and out of foster care. I was born to a mom who was paranoid schizophrenic, and so I literally went home from the hospital and my mom was kept in the hospital for almost a year. And so my whole early childhood was spent bouncing back and forth. But at the age of 10, things sort of blew up completely. And my father was incarcerated with her and I ended up on the street. And so I was on the street in San Francisco for 2 years, and sort of sporadically attending school. And that's when I was put into special programs. So I entered care officially, like, to stay permanently at the age of 12. And when I came in, I had an arrest record for shoplifting, for prostitution. I had sort of a lengthy, sort of long laundry list of things that had already happened at that point in my life. And so I already knew, sort of walking into any setting, that there was a way that all of the adults who worked there were going to perceive me. And even though nobody ever says it out loud to you, you can feel people sort of assessing your chances of success, and I knew that I was ranking very, very low. So by 6th grade, sort of the impact of being placed in the little mentoring program where they only make you attend school for 3 hours a day because they know that's about all the time they can keep you on campus, it had really sunk in and had sort of undermined every single other experience I'd ever had, being in the only classroom in the school that had the computers, like in the GATE program. It's amazing how quickly you can sort of ruin a child's self-esteem, and by projecting your own negative expectations, how you can sort of replace any self-image that they have, because they sort of saw me as one thing, and I definitely accepted that completely. So when I had this opportunity to be in the academic Olympics, it was somewhat embarrassing because I had never seen myself as being smart, but the reason that it happened, I can say for a fact, is because one thing that I did have going for me that's unusual, that actually made my experience in foster care a lot different than a lot of my peers, was that I learned to read at a really young age, and I can't actually tell you how that happened. I just know, like one of those little facts in your mind, I know that I started kindergarten already knowing how to read. And was a super quiet, shy nerd when I was a little kid. So sort of flipped the script once, I hit 10 and, I went the other end of the spectrum. But what that meant for my experience in foster care, that my coping mechanism the entire time I was growing up was to read. So whereas some of my roommates, in the psych hospital and in juvie, they would do things like they'd sniff nail polish and, whatever. For me, it was I'd go lock myself in the bathroom with a book. And in fact, I had the police called on me twice because I wouldn't come out of the bathroom until I had finished reading the chapter in my book. I was writing out to call the police because I'm finishing my book. But it was my way of sort of, growing up, particularly growing up in group homes and institutional care, you are very isolated from the outside world, and you have no idea of what sort of normal experiences are in any community. I didn't know anybody who had an actual job. I didn't know anyone who'd gone to college. I didn't know sort of what people's lives were like who actually lived in families where they would sit down to eat for dinner. But by reading, I had access to all these other lives and experiences, and could sort of imagine that there was something different out there. And so when I really think about, when people ask sort of, what's the thing that made the most difference and why were you able to be successful, I had a particular experience with somebody in community college that I attribute a lot of my success to, but I think a lot of the success comes from the fact that I was able to have access to books and to reading, and not only to sort of know that there was a life different than the one that I was leading and to sort of retain hope in that way, but the other thing that it really did for me was it made me very self-sufficient. And I think about this a lot because when we talk about empowerment for young people and sort of getting them more engaged in their own case planning in their lives and getting them to be more self-advocates, frequently the way that people in the system approach doing that is by developing material that, in all honesty, is developed for folks who have a high literacy level. So it's these fact sheets and cards that list out their statutory rights, and even though it's translated out into youth-friendly language, it still assumes that you're dealing with folks who are comfortable with sort of being given material and processing it and synthesizing it, and that they have the actual ability to do so, which I think, had I not been a reader and sort of educating myself the entire way, there's absolutely no way that I would have been able to access that type of information. But because I was,
It meant that I actually didn't need to rely a whole lot on the adults in the system for information and resources. And so, for example, when I left my group home actually, their standard practice was on people's 18th birthday, they would drive them down the street to an adult homeless shelter and drop them off with their garbage bag of stuff. And that was the last thing I was going to let anybody do to me. So I actually left my group home 3 weeks early. I just, said I'm leaving and I'm moving into the dumpster behind the 7-Eleven. And I'm going to do this on my own because at least I don't have to deal with the adult men. I heard the girls come back and say what would happen to them in the shelter. And I had already been through that sort of involuntarily earlier in my life. And so I wasn't going to allow the system to put me in that position once again. But being homeless in San Jose was much different than being a kid on the street in San Francisco. In San Francisco, we would get picked up in sweeps all the time, and we wouldn't even get arrested. They would just sort of take us in, give us warnings, and release us. They do their little sweeps every once in a while. Every time, probably they were looking for a quota, or were getting some sort of political pressure. In San Jose, people did not want homeless, kids living around the neighborhood. So I had the police called on me constantly. It was very uncomfortable, to be out there. Wasn't really able to. I was always able to hustle up money in San Francisco. I wasn't able to do the same in San Jose. And so I went to where my safe place was, which was the library. I'd spent a lot of time there even when I had been on the street as a kid. And ended up, going to the little resource part in the library and looking through a book there that had a bunch of listings of, shelters and different things, and found the description of Job Corps in there, which was much better than my social worker did for me. Her suggestion when I was leaving care was that I enter a board and care home that was for mentally ill adults, because I was on SSI while I was in care for, being emotionally disturbed, which I think just meant that I was reacting to the fact that they kept putting me in these really crazy placements and doing really crazy things to me. So I found this book, I found the description, and I ended up calling up it was a Women in Community Service office. I called up their office and they said, yeah, there's an application process, so come on in. And so I came in, I started the application process, but I had lived in so many places by that point that I only remembered my last address. So I gave them my last address and they slowly started to get my records, but because I was homeless, I didn't have any other place to be but there. So I was in their office, every single day for, nearly a month as my records started trickling in, and I was thrilled because I love being helpful. And so it's like I could get people coffee, I could run their errands for them, I could answer their phones, I filed their papers. As the records started trickling in, they started getting a picture that the Jennifer who was on the papers was somewhat different than the Jennifer who was their new volunteer secretary in the office, and that the things that were showing up on my records were things that were going to make me ineligible to actually enter the program. They had a zero tolerance policy, meaning they didn't accept people who had any history of violence. I had multiple arrests for assault against staff members in my group homes. And that sounds very serious. It sounds like I was really handling my business when I was in care, and believe me, some of those staff members deserve to be handled based on the things that they were doing. In fact, I wish I could take more credit for what I was doing than it actually was. There were a couple incidents where I threw glasses of water in, a staff person's face, and then they called the police and I was arrested for assault. There was another time where I ended up, a staff member pushed me into a corner and I pushed him back, because that's just, he was used to sort of getting his way with all the girls in the home, and I decided I wasn't going to take it at that particular time. Didn't hurt him, didn't even leave a bruise. But, nonetheless, those were the zero tolerance policy. I had been on psych meds. They didn't accept young people who had a history of being on psych meds. They didn't accept young people who it looked like really wouldn't complete their program. Unfortunately, a lot of our programs that are designed for at-risk youth do. They say we're for at-risk youth. However, if you actually are at risk, we probably can't serve you because we need to report to the feds, positive outcomes. And so we're looking for sort of folks who can help us plead our case that our program works. So luckily for me, they just stopped. As soon as they got the idea, they stopped requesting my records. They said, we can't actually, she lived in too many places, we can't track her stuff down, and they admitted me in. And so, which is sort of how my whole life honestly has come together. It's just always been a series of
fortunate, sort of lucky experiences where somebody has bended a little corner for me, and that's why I really appreciated what was said in the video about, it's really not systems that end up supporting young people, it's individuals, because I definitely attribute sort of being able to even start my trajectory to that person who just said, that's enough. We're going to go with the version of the Jennifer who goes and gets us donuts instead of this other version. We're going to give you a second chance. And that was definitely what I needed. So in Job Corps, when I got into this academic Olympics, I had that experience for the first time of sort of being in an environment where I was considered to be smart and started looking at myself a little bit differently, not very differently, but a little bit differently. We competed nationally against all these other Job Corps centers, and I had all these other people who were cheering me on, who were all, supportive and excited that I knew the names of characters in books. And it was the first time in my life, not only had that information been relevant, but that I had been, sort of not completely embarrassed to admit it to all of the folks who were around me. Because I had been put in all different types of school placements where things like that were not acceptable. Right before I went to that other school that I told you about, I'll tell you one other school. My social worker had actually, one of my expulsions from school had to do with some inappropriate activity that was caught at the school that I was at, and what got reported to my social worker, the only thing she was concerned about was that the other party involved was a black guy. And so she got concerned that perhaps I had self-hate issues because I was involved with somebody who was black, and so went and identified a school in San Jose that was for Mexican-American gang offenders. And so placed me in that school. And so I'd never had any gang affiliation. I came from a neighborhood where most of us dressed a particular way just because we lived in that neighborhood. But of course, I was from San Francisco, San Mateo, Daly City. They had me put out in San Jose. It was a completely different way of dressing, different colors, so first day at that school, got jumped. So I was put in a situation where I wasn't safe. The school was also very oriented around Mexican-American culture, which of course they taught in Spanish for the 2 hours that we were there, and all of our assignments were related to family stuff. So go home, interview your family members, find out their immigration history, come back, report on cultural traditions. And so it was very humiliating for me because, yes, to everyone else externally, I'm Mexican. However, I don't have cultural traditions in the same way. I grew up with a level system, in group homes. My culture has much more to do with foster care than it has to do with, any larger cultural or ethnic group. So that was another way. And I lost my Spanish being put in foster care as well, because in none of the facilities that I lived, we weren't allowed to speak any other language other than English because it was a control issue. They needed to understand what was happening between the residents that were there. So I also didn't understand what was happening half the day, which was fine because I wasn't listening anyway. But it was just sort of another way of further having me check out of school. And it was, that particular social worker, I think, was actually trying to be helpful. At least she was paying attention to the issue of culture. But, put me in a situation where I was not, again, getting a good education. So all of those, starting community college, after I got my GED, I actually didn't say, I want to go to law school. That never happened. What happened is that I moved from the Bay Area to Stockton, and in Stockton, everybody has a GED and is all looking for the same entry-level job. And I had met a guy when I was 19 who had a 3-year-old who basically left me with his 3-year-old. So I was a single parent to his 3-year-old and who had a GED. And so I really needed to be able to get a job that allowed me to support myself in a better way. And so I entered community college, laid out all the brochures, looked for the one that was the shortest program, found it was a medical assisting program, which luckily for me, the prerequisite was a biology class. Went into that class, marched in there thinking I can do it. I did the academic Olympics in Job Corps, I can do biology. And then realized I didn't understand a thing that teacher was saying, but also didn't understand the community college system. So when I decided I was gonna drop, agonized over it, like I'm gonna hurt her feelings, she's gonna take it personal. So showed up in her office to apologize to her because I actually thought she'd even noticed that a student was missing from her class. And she was nice enough to ask me questions about why I was dropping. And one of the things about being in foster care is you are asked for your history so many thousands of times in so many settings that you get used to and as future prospective journalists who are covering this, I think it's important to be aware of this because it comes almost without even thinking about it. When somebody asks you a question, you disclose way more personal information than you may be comfortable with disclosing, because that's every time you're put in a new placement, people want to know your abuse history, they want to know your past placement history, they want to know your diagnosis. And you're just used to, let's just get this over with. I will tell you everything you need to know for intake really quickly. And you just sort of say it like it's second nature, and it sounds like you're perfectly comfortable disclosing the information, and you may not be. It may not be something that you're comfortable with your child being able to Google 10 years from now about you. She basically had an experience where her and her sister were removed in Canada, and her sister was put into foster care. She had a teacher in high school who took her in, and so she knew foster care and sort of saw this as her chance to pay it forward, and so made a deal with me and said, if you'll stick it out in my class until the end of the semester and you're failing at the end of the semester, then I will, drop you with no notation on your transcript. But I think you can do this. And she totally tricked me. She had me grade her papers. She had me clean her house. She had me tutor other students. She had me sit in her office like 24/7. So basically I spent like 13 hours a day with Dr. McRae doing nothing but biology stuff. And of course, by the end of the semester, I had an A because I had been inundated with it, sort of 12 hours a day. And the best way to learn something is by teaching somebody else. And she put me in that position where I was teaching other students. And so I not only had an A in that class, but I had an A in the rest of the classes. And then she started sort of slowly raising the bar on me and replacing all those expectations that I had built up over the years in foster care. And again, it's very easy to do with folks. And so she said, if you're going to do the medical assisting program, why don't you do the LVN? If you're going to do LVN, do RN. If you're going to do RN, why don't you go to medical school? And soon she had me thinking I was going to go to medical school, at which moment I realized I do not like blood. I do not like inflicting pain on people. And so, but if I thought I could go to medical school, I bet you I could probably do anything I wanted to do. So what is it actually that I want to do? And I'm an only child. However, I feel like everyone who's still in care is my sibling. And so I thought I was lucky enough to escape out of all of that mess. I really have an obligation. And I would be privileged to be able to use my life in that way. It would make sort of everything that happened make sense for me. And so that was when I decided I wanted to go to law school. And so was able to then, with her help, I still remember I was also in EOPS in community college, and I had this amazing EOPS counselor who nagged every single week, would send little things to my teachers saying, has Jennifer showed up? Has she turned in her assignments? And so I actually was never able to fall far enough behind that I was able to fail. So I had a 4.0 by the time I was ready to transfer and got accepted everywhere. And so I remember I had all my acceptance letters. They made me apply everywhere. And sitting down with the two of them, and the two of them just arguing, Mr. Cedillo and Dr. McRae arguing, she should go to Berkeley. She got accepted to Berkeley, she should go to Berkeley. And Dr. No, she should stay at Davis because you already know how she is. If she goes to Berkeley, she's going to get caught up in 1,000 other things and she's never going to be in class. So ultimately, Dr. McRae ran, and I went to Davis because she thought it would be the perfect environment, boring, cows, basically nothing to do other than to attend classes, no social justice causes, no advocacy. But of course, I could not stay away from there. So the minute I transferred, I got really involved with California Youth Connection and, started, actually worked full-time doing their legislative work all through college and then through law school. I stayed at Davis for law school. Was fortunate enough that through school, I got full scholarships both for undergrad and for law school, which I'll just say, I'm not saying it actually is something to be proud of. I'm saying that it actually made it logistically possible for me both to attend college because, as I mentioned, I was a single parent, but then also, in order for me to go into doing the work that I wanted to do, which doing this work is the only reason I even attended college at all. And so, going into this work, you can't have excessive student loans because you'll never make that much money. So those were I had pretty intense support services to get me through school. I have never been that good of a student, still to this day. I'm not that great of a student, way too easily distracted. I'm interested in learning about what I'm interested in learning and nothing else. I'm sort of obsessive in that way. I get obsessed and very interested in something and want to do that 24/7 and ignore everything else. So So I've never been that great of a student. However, those support services sort of, and having those folks who were monitoring me help me make it all the way through. Because unfortunately, the thing about it, losing all of that time in middle school and high school is that not only are you learning sort of concrete academic subjects, but you are also learning study skills that are very, very difficult to pick up once you're older. And so I'd never had to do homework, never had homework. In any of the programs that I was in. I'd actually never had to write papers. So luckily for me, I was a reader, so I had some sort of very amorphous writing skills, but no structure to it whatsoever. I had never sort of formally learned how to write a paragraph. I just knew a lot of words and knew how to make things sound pretty, because most of the books that I read, that's how folks wrote. But it's just very hard to make up for all of that lost time, and so having those people and that support there really kept me grounded and kept me, on track all the way through. So starting my advocacy, I think I felt pretty strongly about a few things. One of the things that obviously I felt very strongly about was the need to try to make sure that young people who are in foster care had some level of educational stability, and if they had to have, if there was some disruption in that there would be a way that their transition would be as seamless as possible. That was one area that I felt. I also felt really strongly that it was important to have an advocate in some way. And ideally, I don't think we can ever substitute for a parent when it comes to that. There is no sort of substitute. And when I say parent, I think a foster parent can be, a parent in every sense of the word. But there's no way that we can expect, I appreciated what they said on the video, but I have to disagree. I don't think that there's a program that can substitute for the way a parent monitors, cares, and is invested in an individual child and has a dream for that child. Programs don't do that. Programs simply sort of go through the checklist and monitor in that way. So that's another area I felt really strongly about. I also felt really strongly about the need to look at the quality of the type of schools and the educational programs that children in foster care are placed in, and how important it is that we are not segregating them. I feel like it's a dirty little secret that a lot of kids in foster care end up being segregated for reason of just simply the reason of status of being in foster care, and that because of the demographics of foster care, what that often looks like, it also looks like a racial segregation. So if you look in these classrooms that are community court school, special education for severely emotionally disturbed classroom, you will see mostly black and brown faces, and a majority of those kids are in care. And so that's another area that I felt like there needs to be some attention, because these kids are so isolated to begin with, and the convenient thing for facilities is to say, rather than having to transport to 5 different schools, we will just open up our own school and have everybody attend school there. And in fact, the trend I think now is even more alarming, where people have sort of given up on the idea that they can have some sort of educational stability, and instead are saying, we will build these mega group homes, and I don't care what you want to call it. I don't care if you want to call it a boarding school or it is a group home. Any facility where you do not have parents and you live in an institutional setting is a group home. So we will keep you in an institution, and you will attend school the whole time, and there will be a high graduation rate. Well, of course, in juvenile hall, like if you're at CYA, you will also see nearly 100% graduation rate in CYA, because there's nothing else to do and they can make you go to school. I feel we can do better than that. I don't think that young people in foster care should have to choose between having a family and living in a setting where they have a mom and a dad and being able to graduate from high school. So I know this is extremely unpolitically correct to say, because the trend across the country is to look at these boarding schools sort of and to say they're good enough for the kids of rich parents, why can't we have them for kids in foster care? But what everybody forgets is the kids of rich parents, at the end of the day, they still have parents. When it comes summer break, Christmas break, they have a family to return home to. They have people who are dreaming dreams for them and who have expectations, who are sending them care packages. A mentor cannot replace that. Kids need families. And they also need to get a good high school education. And we're not going to pick here. I'm not doing that. These are my brothers and sisters, and I'm not making them pick that. It's just an impossible decision to make. I think we can do both. So that's another area that I felt really strongly invested in. And then lastly, obviously, because I feel like so much of my success I can attribute to what happened in those early years I also think it's really important to focus in on that area of making sure that very young kids, the 0 to 5 population, that we're preparing them and giving them the foundation that once they start school, they start ready. And I think quality preschool is important, but in all honesty, the way that young children develop that foundation, as many of you, it sounds like you all are doing reading, the way that they've developed that foundation is through their experience with caregivers. And so if we have babies who, you know, are moving placements every few months and, you know, who are experiencing 7 or 8 placements, you know, the way that a baby learns language is by speaking to their parent and having their parent speak back. The way that they learn to regulate their own emotions and their feelings is by feeling loved and cared and nurtured. You know, and those are things that parents do. So if we don't focus in on sort of parenting and the importance of that, and I think we could actually singularly focus on that for our young ones. If we could get them into great high quality preschool programs and high quality daycare and get them into their EPSDT screenings, if we could do all that for them, great, that would be icing on the cake. However, the very foundation, none of that matters if they do not live with a loving, nurturing parent who can sort of do all of the psychobiological foundation that's needed for them to actually be in a place where they can learn. So, yes.
My question was, you stated how in the beginning you were like, so you were on psych, you had to go to a psych hospital, and things of that nature. How did those different, I don't know how to, classifications in a sense affect you feeling as if you would be able to learn in such in an educational environment, and in what ways should that be approached when talking to these kids and, you know, trying to help these kids, but when they've been told from maybe 5 to 10 that you have ADHD, post-traumatic stress, things of that nature, just in a sense, how does that affect your ability to feel as if you can learn in general?
Well, a couple of things about growing up in foster care. One of them is that we all have our bad days. When you're in foster care, the bad days, what ends up happening is that they are looked at through a microscope, number one. And so, I've had lots of friends who weren't in foster care tell me about the experience they had where their mom locked them out of the door and they punched through the window, and their mom basically grounded them for a week afterwards. So if you were in care, you'd be in the psych hospital when that happened. You'd be arrested in juvenile hall. So, all sort of normal childhood behaviors are looked at in a way that's highly abnormal. So that's an out of context of what the situation is. And then once you have that experience of getting put in the psych hospital or, get put in juvenile hall, it never leaves you. So it's there in your case file, and from that point on, it sort of becomes a permanent part of who you are, and everyone knows it. And so even as a concrete thing of like them finding another placement for me, by the time I left care, I was in level 14 group home, simply because no group home lower than a level 14 or a residential treatment center would take somebody who had the list of things that I had, accumulated since, the time I was born till then. It's not as if you can ever say, could we start my case file over again? Like, I'm deciding that, things are gonna be different. So I also knew that, and I sort of just took that for granted. I took that for granted that that's the way it was for everybody, that you actually don't get second chances, that all of those things seemed like everyone else believed all of those things were me. That was the whole of who Jennifer was. And because they believed that, and they were all professionals and they had these degrees and important positions, I also believed that. And so there was sort of no way that you would have actually been able to convince me that I wasn't damaged property at that point. So I think it's very challenging when you are working with young people who've experienced those things and who know, that you're judging them in that way, to convince them that they can be seen in any other way. The only reason I allowed that teacher to, sort of see something different for me was because she had no idea, and she made this bargain with me. And if I'd known what she was doing, I honestly would never have gone for it. If I knew she thought I could get an A in the class and that she thought I was smart, I would have immediately said, I'm not going to do this because I'm going to let you down. But I didn't realize what she was doing until the end. So I almost think, there's a preventative approach that has to happen. But the way that we interact with young people, like oftentimes when I talk to social workers, I tell them, don't read the case file before you meet the kid. Go meet the kid first and tell them that you didn't read their case file. So because they're so used to everybody walking in already with all these preconceptions and prejudgments about who they are. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, I should be letting you field the questions. No.
Well, I mean, it doesn't. It's
Okay.
okay. I mean, we can. Yeah. I'm just. Okay. Yeah. No, I get all. I mean, that was for your experience. You got the second chance after a lot of missed opportunities throughout that whole thing. Allison is showing us a video and talking to us about the changes that are being made and are happening. And just as like a framing thing, you fought for this stuff at CYC, and now you're at the Youth Law Center with ostensibly a lot more power. So I'm just, just very quickly, I mean, has it gotten better?
I think it has gotten better. Let me answer this two ways. So I think what's gotten better is that the policies and programs have gotten better. So, one of the things I told you, sort of the things that I felt like were important. When I was at CYC, one of the first things that I started working on was this, Educational Bill of Rights, AB 490. Some of you might be familiar with that. And so we put together this bill that basically was the first, legislation here in California that was a foster Bill of Rights. So it did things like allow youth to immediately enroll at a new school so that they didn't experience, because as I came into CYC, I was so obsessed with this idea around education. I started checking with other youth and finding out that my experience was not unique. And so we decided this is what's really important. Young people need to be able to enroll in school immediately if their placement changes. They need to be able to stay in their home school, if at all possible. There needs to be a preference for the regular comprehensive public school, no special schools, just sort of as a matter of default. There needs to be an education liaison, an advocate, somebody who's going to track, the kids that are in care. There needs to be a uniform way of calculating credits across the board. So we put all these ideas together in a bill, and we got this bill passed, and so that's great. That was 2003. So it's been a number of years, and we're still working on implementation, lots of glitches across the state. The next year, and I always remember because this was the year that I actually was pregnant with my son, who's now going to be 8 this year. But the next year, I took on the non-public school issue because I just felt, one of the first things I did was that I started researching I knew what my experience had been in terms of my own experience, but I didn't understand why it happened. And I didn't understand the funding streams and the statute behind it. So I was particularly interested in the non-public school thing. And so started looking at, how the funding worked for the non-public schools and how those type of decisions were made, and realized that it was really shady. That there were these group homes that were operating as nonprofit organizations that were basically going and incorporating another organization that would operate a non-public school but had the same boards of directors, and then were drawing down a lot of money, like sometimes $100,000 a year per child, to have their child in their non-public school in addition to the regular residential rate. And so they were getting both pools of money at the same time for the same child, and the services were more or less the same. So they were double and triple billing in many cases, for sort of the same therapeutic services. A lot of and at the same time we're offering, in the schools that I went to, and I checked this out again with they had textbooks that were from the 70s, that were there. They had teachers who did not have teaching credentials. They were just sort of babysitters. They would have us play dominoes and put on movies for us. One time the teacher had us watch a porno, as our educational assignment. I bet you because he wanted to watch a porno. So it was basically the worst quality of education possible, and it was supposed to be for the students who had the greatest needs, who had a need to be in sort of the most restrictive classroom and to be getting the most specialized services. We were sort of getting the least services educationally that you can possibly imagine. Lots of the dittos that they just photocopy out of books, that's what we did. There was no one-on-one instruction. No opportunities to ever have a school dance or to participate in any, extracurricular activities, because a little one-room schoolhouse with just all the kids that you lived with all the time. So that year, 2004, took on that one and did a bill, AB 1858, that basically said that if a young person has to be in a non-public school because it is the only educational option for them, then they have to have access to all of the same classes, including college and AP classes that the district offers. They have to have access to all the same books, supplies, materials, all of the extracurricular activities that are offered, that the non-public school placement has to be evaluated every few months, that there has to be an exit plan out. So basically trying to make it, and that every single teacher has to have a credential, and it needs to be a special education credential. And you have no idea how hard I had to fight the non-public schools to get that one, because they said we're all going to go out of business if we have to have special education credentialed. And still now every once in a while I run into somebody who lost their job at a non-public school who, is telling me sort of bitterly the story of how they lost their job, and I'm like, I know you wouldn't like me right now. So it really was a significant change because they were so used to being unregulated, and still, they are still very much under the radar. What many of these schools have done is that they've let the County Office of Education sort of come in and take over operation, which provides somewhat of a better educational experience. However, it still doesn't address the core issue around segregation that I think is really important to look at. Part of your experience, particularly in middle school and high school, is around socialization in school, in all honesty. It's about sort of what you can learn from your peers and the resources that you get from sort of looking at different ways of life. And it's part of the problem with the idea around all foster or at-risk boarding schools is that you don't have those type of resources from other students. So that was another way, and sort of I've tried to do that all the way along. We also fought really hard to get the Chafee grants expanded because I knew for me how important financial aid was while I was in school. So this is a particular pool of money that's dedicated for foster youth to support their higher education every year. And we also fought really hard to institutionalize. Told you how important it was for me to have that one person who was nagging. But, when I started at CYC, I think there were 4 Guardian Scholar programs, and so we pushed over a number of years to get that number up to the 70 something that you see it's at now, which is just, it's super impressive because there are ways with sort of, that's one of the things when I deconstruct my own experience and I talk to other young people and deconstruct theirs, there are ways of institutionalizing sort of almost everything that worked. But it really does takes effort and sort of thinking about, breaking down some of the barriers and the ways that people are thinking. So to answer your question, and thank you for prompting in that way, yeah, I think if you have a program that just sort of systematically says, we don't care about your background, and in fact your background may be an asset to whatever it is that you're about to do. We're not going to judge you, and you're going to be in a community of peers, because that was very affirming to me to join CYC, and now suddenly I was not the only crazy group home one. There was all of these other people who, many of them were older than me, and I could look at them and think, they seem perfectly normal. They don't seem crazy at all. There's a way that stigma gets decreased, and the Guardian Scholar programs, I think, try to institutionalize that sort of level of acceptance and of saying, this is your second chance just institutionally, and we're going to support you in whatever it is that you choose to do. And I often think about that when I started law school, and sort of listened to them describe what they hoped we'd learn by the end of law school. And, I thought, really what you're saying is that you hope you're going to teach us how to argue well with people, how to be somewhat manipulative, and and sort of how to influence people to do what you want them to do. Well, read my case file, because it says that I'm a pro at all of those things, so, could we just get to the end? I'll take the bar exam now. So, I think that there is a way that you can reframe for young people who have had all those experiences, how things that might have previously been looked at as deficits are actually going to be assets in different contexts.
Well, I think going along with that, so you said that if you knew what this Dr. McGray had expected of you, that she thought you were going to get an A, and that all these things, that you would have disengaged right there because you wouldn't have felt that it was a possibility.
Realistic, yeah.
And so, how do you think is the best way to communicate to foster youth or youth who have lowered, belief that they can't be effective in school, to do something like get a second chance, but not be like, we think you're going to get an A? I mean, how do you communicate that?
I mean, I think it's like parenting. It's very simple. It's like you have to sort of create little progressive baby steps to convince. You can't, there's nobody who could have ever walked into my life, and especially, in all honesty, most of the people I felt like who worked with me, I looked at them and I thought, you don't know anything about me and people like me, because you have your cushy little life and your family, and you know, you might have all these like great little ideas in your mind, but you don't know what I'm facing when I leave. And so I really needed to learn that for myself and to have those experiences to be able to prove that to myself. Nobody else could have convinced me of that. And so I think it's really important, again, to institutionally create little progressive experiences where young people can be successful at something, where they can feel useful and feel needed and feel like they're contributing in, you know, some way. And then once you, it's just the basic premise of youth development, right? It's like once you master that particular experience, and you can move on to the next. And for me, it was really, you know, sort of the civic engagement piece of what I got involved with at CYC of, you know, okay, for the first time I'm gonna move a bill through the legislative process. And so now that I'm able to move a bill through the legislative process, let me try a federal bill and see if I can move that through the legislative process. And once I'm able to do that, you know, let me think about maybe I'd be good at going to law school, and maybe I could do litigation. And so, you know, those are sort of large examples, but I think with a young person who is, say, in high school, giving them an opportunity where, you know, they could, for the first time, find something that they're good at doing and, you know, have the chance to do that. And that's why I think organizations like the California Youth Connection are really amazing, because they give young people, you know, oftentimes for the first time, an opportunity to do something where everybody applauds when they're done, as opposed to, you know, writing down in the log for the group home, or, you know, that things, how bad they were.
Yeah, I also want to thank you for sharing your experience. I work in San Jose with foster youth, so I could validate a lot of stuff that you said. One thing that I caught though, you were mentioning like when the teacher was asking to interview your family, started using like the Latino culture, and it's big on family. I mean, what I noticed is that the foster care system doesn't really know how to teach Latino culture to foster youth, because you can't really take away the family part and explain Latino culture. And the challenge I always had with Latino youth was that, like, explaining you are Latino, you are part of this community. But now let's break it down. Now let's see how we're going to teach you your culture in a way. So when you said that, it just kind of reminded me when I worked with this youth. He had ancestry from Chile, but he thought he was Mexican because he was always around Mexicans. I'm like, you're Latino, you have ancestry in Chile, and it was during that time where those miners got trapped and everything. So I told him, look, there's some stuff going on in Chile right now, so we can look into. So I don't know if you had experience with that, or with your program. How do we teach in Latino culture possibly?
Well, you know, I mean, I think there are a lot of cultural issues in foster care. It's true with Latino youth, it's also true with African American youth, and it's true with Native American youth as well. And I mean, what ends up happening, I mean, those are the largest, they're disproportionately represented. Like, Latino youth are not, but in counties like Santa Clara, they are disproportionately represented, right?
More and more.
Yep, and so, and I imagine we're gonna see that increasingly as time goes on. So, you know, I think, first of all, it's, again, sort of expanding the way that we talk about culture and looking for those experiences. And so for young people who are isolated from their culture of origin, finding ways that they can get involved in activities or communities. I was recently at an event that was actually about racial disproportionality, and there were professionals who were up on the stage and they were talking about the data, and this Native American youth, he raised his hand and he was like, look, I'm placed outside of the reservation, I just want to know, when can I go to my powwow? And they were like, we'll get back to that. That's not really what we're talking about right now. And I raised my hand and I was like, that's exactly what we're talking about right now. You know, I mean, sort of the data's important, but what's also important is that we're connecting young people to those activities and experiences, because there's no way when you're living in an environment, and for me I was living in institutions, and so there was really no culture at all. But a lot of young people are placed in foster homes where there's just different, you know, ethnicity, and so, you know, the food is different in the home, the religion is different, you know, the church that they go to, the language that's spoken in the home is different, and that's going to become part of their identity as well. I have a very good friend who, she's Mexican, has been in foster care since birth. She was raised in a African American foster home, and you can't tell her she's not Black. And, you know, culturally, it's like, well, that's her culture. That's, you know, that's who she is. And so she has to, I think it would be helpful for her to have experiences where she can embrace the fact that even though internally, culturally, this is how she was raised, this is how you're going to be perceived. And so know that part of sort of your heritage as well. But you can't tell somebody those things. They've got to actually have the experiences, and they've got to feel like they belong and they are accepted. Because that's what I've always struggled with, is as soon as I was in foster care, I almost felt rejected by other Mexican American folks who, you know, would want to know why I didn't speak Spanish, who'd want to know where my family is. And, you know, when I would say I'm in foster care, would sort of look at me like, well, what'd you do? You know, as opposed to, so I think they rejected, and so I pushed back as well, and I'm like, well, I'm just Jennifer, that's okay. Like, I don't need to belong to a cultural group. I've never been a groupie kind of person anyway, you know, I'll just be a group of one, and that's fine. But I think it would have been much different if I had actually felt accepted by a particular group, and I don't think you can feel accepted unless you have those chances, you know, to sort of, and it could be very small chances. They could be things like, you know, enrolling in a dance class, you know, Aztec dance class, or, you know, taking a West African dance class, or, you know, participating in some sort of a project that's going to the powwow, going to a basket weaving thing. But those are things that are they're easier said than done in foster care. There's so little access to activities that are non-foster care related.
Following along with that conversation, it's really interesting, and maybe just want to get your perspective on whether at that time did you tell someone, well, you know, being in the Latino culture is not my priority. Maybe my priority is being in a culture where I can, you know, excel in my reading, or, you know, at that time, were you able to maybe vocalize that, or maybe
Absolutely
it was
not.
at
No.
that time?
I mean, that's what's interesting. It's like, I did not know what my priorities were at that particular time. I mean, I was just dealing with a lot in my life. And again, like I said, when I meet young people who are clear about their priorities and who have a plan, I'm always very impressed because you have to understand sort of the amount of pressure and trauma that they are doing that in spite of. And so I had no idea who I was or what I was doing, and I didn't have priorities because that would be way too risky, because none of my life was in my control at that point in time. People would walk in and tell me, we're moving you this afternoon and we're moving you to a different city, so get all your stuff together. We're not telling you where we're taking you. You'll find out when we get there. You know, sometimes I'd come back from school and my stuff would just be ready and the social worker sitting in the living room. You can't actually make priorities or any sort of plan when you feel like my life is not my life. And also when you feel like everyone else is judging. I just took everybody's word for, you know, okay, you've got this. You're gonna do what you're gonna do, and I know I can't stop you from doing that. And so I kind of just let it go. And, you know, I mean, for the first couple of years, yes, I fought. And like one of the things I was clear about is I don't want to live in these places. I want to be in a family. But after you're told no so many times, and you're told no in a way that makes you think that, like, I'm just imagining if I had stand up to my social worker and said, my priority is to be someplace where there are people like me who like to read. She would have laughed in my face. You know, nobody saw me. Nobody knew I liked to read. That was my secret thing. You know, so people did not see me as an intellectual in the least bit. I still think there are people who, like now when I meet them, they sort of know me in one element of my life, and then they'll ask me, so what do you do anyway? And I'll say I'm a lawyer. I get that look like, really? You're a lawyer? So I think, you know, there are ways that even the best of us judge young people, and so creating spaces, I think, again, this is very squishy, not policy based, but yeah, creating those spaces where young people can discover who they are and what their strengths are, so that they're able to prioritize and feel empowered enough to articulate those things, are really important. And again, that requires those little progressive youth development opportunities to start feeling like, yeah, I'm capable and my voice is important.
Who do we want? Ms. Ovis.
So, this is a question really, I think for both of you. So, I'm a former special education teacher, and one of the things, my first placement as a special education teacher was in a self-contained special ed class, and I had a class, it was 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders all in one class. It was all boys, and all of them, in addition to any learning disability that they may have had, were also diagnosed with being emotionally disturbed. And I ended up having this really, like, I don't know, this monumental conversation with the principal of my school, who was like, what do I do? I don't know what to do with this class, because every day it was like a war zone in my classroom. And I said, who thought that this was a good idea? I mean, I was like, are you kidding me? This is the exact recipe for disaster. There's no way to.
Contagion.
Right. You know, there is no model to see, okay, well, how might I effectively deal with this problem? It's like everybody's doing what everybody else is doing. So I guess what it brings me to is what I keep hearing is like, and I think it applies in so many ways, clearly with what you're discussing, Jennifer, as far as like foster youth are concerned, people, just children in general who are diagnosed with any kind of learning or emotional, you know, disability. And even we have the same problem with like racial and ethnic and socioeconomic status. Isolation pieces, like the piece that I'm getting at is like isolation. And, you know, you talked about with like the for-profit schools and trying to get them regulated, but it's still isolated. So I guess my biggest question comes to like, how do you deal with the isolation and try and dismantle that so that that is no longer so pervasive in our institutions?
Well, first off, you don't fund them. I mean, that's specifically why we're working with the systems, why we're bringing district leaders together with leaders in the child welfare system. That our goal is not to pull, when I worked with foster youth in New York, that was the strategy, to pull the youth out of the school and put them in their own little place. And that's one thing that I appreciated coming to California and seeing how the youth development programs work, that there really is, you know, the goal of positive youth development programs coming up by the youth and for the youth, and as well as adapting the system to serve the needs more of the young people. So yeah, that's what we're doing. We're trying to work with the school districts the most and the child welfare systems, and taking the community resources that are out there and bringing those people in to share and exchange resources. Even just something as simple as creating like an online web portal where all of the resources of best practices can be. Something like that doesn't exist, and it's actually the role of philanthropy to do that, because the school districts don't have the money to do that. So that's sort of what I'm trying to do, remove barriers to information. The whole purpose of this video was to create a culture shift with how people work with foster youth. And each of those folks in there, you know, what they were saying, they're each leaders that have, you know, bought into it and really are thinking in positive, forward-thinking ways. And so we're just trying to create a spread of that ripple effect of the way that people look at the issue. And the only thing I'll add to that is I think it's a lot like shelters here in California. It's like, and anywhere else, as long as they exist, people will use them. If you just eliminate them as an option, then they won't be an option. I mean, and you know, I mean, it's very simple, but I think it's true. So if you sort of create barriers and say you can't place youth who are in foster care in these segregated special ed, because we know there's a whole body of research about contagion and the result of, you know, peers learning other peer behaviors. It's not good for them to be. I think that's one. So you just eliminate the option. As a couple of interim steps, I think what Allison mentioned earlier about, you know, really arming caregivers, foster parents, relative caregivers to learn how to navigate the system and fight for the young people who are in their care, because special education in particular, it is so parent driven. You know, sort of the loudest, squeakiest wheel gets the services that are needed and that are actually specialized for their child, and the quiet dormouse gets nothing. Their child will get sort of the worst of the worst. And so, you know, many of our foster parents and our relative caregivers, unfortunately, you know, work in systems where they feel like if they are loud, vocal advocates who are fighting against the system, they're not going to get placements. You know, that's actively discouraged. And so I think arming them in a different way and sort of changing our agency culture so that they accept you are the parent and you are supposed to fight for this child, because this child needs a whole lot of fighting. They need somebody in their corner. And that's really important. The other thing that I think cannot be understated is those schools should be regulated. Why would it be that we have the kids who have the greatest needs, you know, in placements that are getting the highest rate, who are supposedly providing the most services? Why would they be exempt from things like testing and, you know, and regulation of all of their? So Department of Education should be going out and should be regularly doing really intensive monitoring of the type of services that they're providing and holding them to an even higher standard than we hold our regular comprehensive public schools. I mean, especially given that if you look at the pot of special ed money, the amount of special ed money that is going to funding those, it's really extreme. I mean, there's a lot of money being poured in. We shouldn't be accepting that they're just sort of allowed to operate. But I think all of that's interim. We just got to get to the point. That option doesn't exist for our kids.
We're really wrapping up here. So Eve, will you manage the last question?
Yeah.
And now I got to run out in a second. So.
Last question.
Yeah, please.
I'm just curious because you were Jennifer, because you were talking a lot about some of the decisions that were made and some of the things that were said by social workers or done in like different placements, and just this is a class that maybe has about 3 journalism students, but a majority of people are in here are in social welfare and may end up becoming social workers for kids in situations like yours. And so, what is it that you think needs to be present in the modern day social worker? What are some of the new practices that need to be developed? Because a lot of things just naturally that are going to be taught are going to be things that are passed down through past systems, and what worked in 1999 is not working in 2012. So what would be some of the things that you think the new social worker needs to know?
So here, I can a couple of things right off top of my head, and maybe more will come to me. One of the things that I think is really important for new social workers to know is that the traditional model of sort of the young person being your client and you providing the services, that is not a helpful model for young people who are in foster care. That really the most helpful thing you can do as social workers is sort of help that young person feel responsibility and learn how to own their life as their own life. Because they ultimately, I mean, we have this model in child welfare of trying to localize all of our services inside and sort of keep young people in those isolated environments and that type of thing. And guess what? The only other place where you experience that is prison when you're an adult. You know, it sort of doesn't help in terms of that feeling like I have agency over my own life. I know how to get resources. If I'm 24 and a single parent and I run out of food, I can't just call my social worker and say, hey, me and my baby don't have food. I need to know how to go out and go to the food bank on the bus and, you know, sort of feel like there are services out in the world. So that's one thing, is sort of changing the dynamic to say, this is your life, young person, and I am here in the role to help you get what you need. I'm not here to do it for you, and I am not here as the professional who knows more about your life, even though I only spend an hour a month with you. So I think that's really important. The other thing that I think is really important, and I think it's being taught more and more in social work, is that, you know, really our system needs to be focused around parenting. And it is not focused around parenting. And that's for every single young person who's in care. I mean, the most important intervention, the only really important intervention that foster care can offer, if you decide that a child, you know, is not being adequately parented at home, then we have a responsibility to make sure they're put in another setting where they are going to get high quality parenting, period. And that's sort of the most important thing. All of the other services, again, they're great, but there's nothing that can replace that experience of feeling like you are loved and cared for and that you have a mother in the system. And so whether that's, you know, the effort to reunify you back with your biological, you know, family, or if it's to put you in a setting where you are living with somebody else. And we've been really fortunate at the Youth Loss Center Stewart Foundation actually started with funding us on something called the Quality Parenting Initiative, which we're trying to get child welfare departments to focus on this for the first time. What is high quality parenting? What does that actually mean? What are the expectations? Not acceptable that the way we recruit for sort of the kids who have experienced the most trauma and they're most vulnerable is by saying, do you have a room in your home that's this square foot by this square foot that has one bed and one dresser? You know, instead we really should be looking for people that have this, either the ability to learn the very specialized skill set that it's going to require to parent these kids, or who already naturally have it from some other setting, and making them the key. They're the key member of that intervention team. It's not the social worker, it's not the therapist, it's not the attorney, it's not the juvenile court judge, it's the foster parent. Because they are the person who lives with that child 24/7. They are going to be the one responsible for working with the biological parents in reunification. They're going to be the one helping that child believe that, reaffirm their faith that adults can be good and safe people, to re-believe in family again. They're going to be the ones instilling those educational expectations. They're going to be the ones sitting there helping them with their homework, filling out the college application. And I feel like we so underestimate the foster parent in the whole equation. When we talk about child welfare reform, we are not talking about caregivers. It's sort of like they're the afterthought, and to me, they're the very first thing to think about. And you know, and that's going back to my experience. You don't get parented in institutions. Children cannot get parented by a group home, by a juvenile hall, by a psych hospital. So, and every single kid, I don't think anybody would disagree, deserves parenting. So those are, I know I have you guys over time, so I'll stop there. But I think those, if you just walk away with those two things, they're important.
And I think the only other thing that I would add is just to do exactly what you guys are doing. The fact that this is a cross-sector class is really amazing. And for a social worker to have the capacity to write an op-ed and have the skills for that, or really know how you pass a bill, we need more of that. When I was at Berkeley MSW program, there was one day when somebody from philanthropy called, came and talked to us. One day. I was a MAP student. And philanthropy, that's my life now, and it's had so much capacity to move the systems change too. If you can identify in other sectors leaders and folks who are equally curious about cross-system collaboration, I think that that's a great strategy.
Wow. I really want to thank you guys so much for being here today. It has been truly, truly great. Thank you.